welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eunjung Cho. Ahead of the self-imposed year-end deadline for the talks with the United States, Chairman Kim Jong-un is making frequent visits to the sacred mountain of Baekdu. There, he emphasized a self-reliant economy. Today, we discuss how much Chairman Kim needs a breakthrough to breathe new life into the crippled North Korean economy.
실현과 도전을 과감히 짚으시며 자력 부강, 자력 번영의 한 길로 도도히 전진하는 우리 조국의 찬란한 내일을 그려준
is because our sanctions have had significant economic impact on their economy.
In the studio with me today, Mr. William Brown, professor at the Georgetown University. Professor Brown spent 3 decades in the U.S. government, including the CIA and the Commerce Department, focusing on the North Korean and Chinese economies. Also joining me, Mr. Joshua Stanton, a lawyer in Washington, D.C. Mr. Stanton has helped the U.S. Congress draft numerous North Korea sanctions bills and laws. His blog, freekorea.us, focuses on North Korea sanctions and humanitarian and political conditions in Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, Professor Brown, Chairman Kim Jong-un recently visited Samjiyon and emphasized a self-reliant economy. For Chairman Kim to travel all the way to the sacred mountain of Baekdu and give a symbolic speech, how bad is the current state of the North Korean economy?
Yeah, I think it's pretty bad, actually, and that's saying something about North Korea, because North Korea's economy is never very strong. And in fact, I think they're having a big meeting this month in Pyongyang, probably in preparation for Kim's talk. He always gives a January 1st big talk about the economy. And I think he's probably having trouble figuring out what he wants to say in that talk. As they go through their numbers, what they'll see is, first of all, trade, exports. Actually, they've had a little bit of a rebound from an incredibly bad 2018. We like to say in financial world, a dead cat bounce. It's kind of a nasty way to put it, but it's a small uptick from a very bad year in 2018, both exports and imports. But the main thing is the level of exports are not near high enough to bring in the imports that they need to bring in to build the economy. So I think they look at that figure, the trade figures. They'll look at their industrial figures. What I think on the economy, I like to put in 2 different pieces, the state economy and the private economy. The state economy suffered badly, I think, in 2018 and has continued to do poorly. Last year, 2018, the market economy sort of filled in. But I'm afraid this year the market economy also is doing poorly because they have to have a very tight monetary policy. So all in all, I think it's not a very happy time in Pyongyang.
Mr. Stanton, so do you see any signs of distress from the elites and the money-making overseas trading companies?
So yes, I do. But I think that distress probably peaked about 6 months ago. Starting in May 2018, right before the Singapore summit, Donald Trump personally, and to the great surprise of his own cabinet, halted a large round of sanctions designations. And since May 2018, we have seen no significant new sanctions designations. So we're back to Obama-level sanctions pressure on North Korea. Now, the pressure that has already been exerted is strong, but North Korea is adaptable. So yes, there is evidence of things like real estate prices falling in Pyongyang, some defections of security officials, but for the most part, I see these effects as slowly dissipating with a half-life of about 9 months to 1 year.
And Professor Brown, recently the International Trade Center data showed that North Korea's export dropped by 90% compared to 2015 when it was $3 billion to in 2018 it's $330 million. And North Korea's trade deficit to China is the largest ever. And do you think the China's trade data shows the complete picture of what's going in and out of North Korea in terms of goods, services, and money?
Probably not. I mean, clearly there's a lot of other stuff going on behind the scenes. But I basically believe the trade data. It shows such a huge picture of a collapse of trade. Where they just put out their data for October of this year. It shows a record-breaking North Korean deficit, $254 million just in that 1 month. Now, I'm sure that's not all of it. There's, transfer payments, there's workers' remittances, there's some aid, there's other stuff. So it's not fair to say a $253 million deficit for the month. But it's probably half of that. It's probably $200 million deficit.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Stanton, in 2017, United Nations Security Council adopted resolutions 2371, 2375, and 2397 banning coal and textiles and seafood exports, practically banning all exports of North Korea. And Professor Brown just said that sanctions have an immense impact on the North Korean economy. Do you think the UN sanctions are very effective right now?
They are effective. I would not say that they're very effective because there's a lot of cheating going on, particularly by China and Russia. We see open source reporting about North Korea exporting coal through either ship-to-ship transfers off the Chinese coast or through ports in Russia. And until the U.S. government is prepared to impose some consequences on the banks and the ports and the flags of convenience that facilitate all of this illicit trade, we're not really going to see very effective sanctions. Mm-hmm. And that particularly applies to the banking sector, where money laundering is, frankly, the single greatest vulnerability of the North Korean economy that we have not fully exploited. The pressure on North Korea is in no sense maximum. Mm-hmm. We have maximum pressure on Iran. We do not have maximum pressure on North Korea.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Brown, Chairman Kim Jong-un puts a special focus on developing tourist resorts like Kumgang, Samjiyon, Wonsan, Galma. Under the current sanctions regime, how important is the tourism industry?
Tourism is one area that's, now there are two sets to say. There are the UN sanctions we talk about, and then there's very different sets of many different types of US sanctions. U.S. sanctions prohibit Americans from going to North Korea generally. It makes it very hard. But the UN sanctions don't prohibit Chinese or other people coming to North Korea. So it makes some sense, I think, for Kim to focus on tourism. And I think there's estimates of like 1 million Chinese coming to North Korea last year. They don't spend a lot of money. That helps on that current account a little bit.
And could I just add one point, is that the travel, the U.S. sanctions on travel to North Korea are by U.S. nationals using U.S. passports. But I think it's fair to assume that a lot of the tourism money that goes into North Korea, including from Chinese tourists, is going through the U.S. financial system, and that's because of a loophole in U.S. law. Previously, we had a sanction against Cuba that banned those transactions. Congress could impose a similar sanction on North Korea. It would require legislation, and it would essentially preempt a reopening of Kumgang, and it would shut down Samjiyon and Wonsan before they were even able to start.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very difficult for U.S. Congress to stop Chinese tourists from going to North Korea. They're going to go, and they're not going to do anything bad. They spend a little money. In fact, I would probably argue that we should relax some of our travel restrictions on North Korea. I think a lot of good things can come from tourism, as long as there's security. We make some deals on the security angle so that people are treated well. And that most importantly to me is that any money used in North Korea is used in the private sector and not by the state.
I personally think that if those conditions could be met, my mind might also be changed on the benefits of tourism to North Korea. But we are now headed into a phase where tensions between the U.S. and North Korea are clearly going to increase. Then that raises the risk that more tourists will end up like Otto Warmbier ended up. It will mean that there will be hostage rescue flights to North Korea. It will mean less possibility for Americans to have contact with North Korea. And it will mean that the funds from tourism will be used to undermine the sanctions that we need to disarm North Korea and have a lasting peace in Korea. So at some point when we see a fundamental change in the behavior of the North Korean government, and I think that food aid and the transparent delivery of food aid may be the first sign of that, then I think that we can take a fresh look at tourism and whether that has a good cost-benefit ratio.
And Professor Brown, you said that Chinese tourists don't spend so much money in North Korea as opposed to maybe South Korean or American tourists. And what do you think are the limits then that Chairman Kim is currently pursuing of developing tourism industry under the sanctions regime?
Oh, I think there are very severe limits because you see the construction work they're doing, but you know they're good at making cement buildings, but nothing much else. And Chinese are not so demanding, so they come. I don't think they'll come back. What they really need is high-class tourist facilities that can be easily developed if they have some kind of franchise agreement with Western or Japanese or Korean companies. That can't happen with the sanctions. The sanctions prohibit any kind of investment. So I think Stanton is right. There's limits to this development. I think it makes sense for Kim to be focusing on it in this sort of self-reliant mode that he's in, but it'll run into big limits, and it won't save his economy by any means.
And Mr. Stanton, so North Korea has this large trade deficit officially, but North Korea is also doing cyber attacks and earning money there. So what is the importance of North Korea's illicit activities in terms of its revenue making?
The question about bank fraud on a massive scale against, for example, the Bangladesh bank is also one source and probably a fairly important source of money that Kim Jong-un is using to recoup money. It's important to remember, however, that most of that money ultimately has to be funneled through the Chinese banking system. And to the extent that we can make the Chinese banking system fearful of the consequences of laundering the proceeds of illicit activity, well, that's classic money laundering. The bank officers really are moving that money through the U.S. financial system, and we have court documents from the D.C. Circuit recently that tell us that this is the case. Then we will see that those funds could become trapped in the Chinese banking system.
Professor Brown, is the North Korean economy currently in a recession, feeling the blow of the sanctions regime, do you think?
I think so. You know, they don't produce any data, so you can't say their GDP dropped 2 quarters or whatever. But I think just anecdotal information, the trade data, but also a lot of material provided by North Korean defectors or people in South Korea and in China show. And actually, Kim Jong-un's own speeches tell it very clearly. 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years, he had a very great speech talking about prosperity, their move prosperity, and then they had the summits. Well, now he's not talking about that anymore. He's talking about belt tightening and self-reliance. I think that's very disheartening to most North Koreans, hearing this term self-reliance. They've heard it all their lives. What that means is they can't use specialization of labor to trade, to make really complicated materials that need foreign inputs. One part of the trade issue, I think, right now that's really affecting North Korean industry and what they're probably very worried about is, according to the UN sanctions, but also the Chinese data, and anecdotally, almost no Chinese or foreign equipment, machinery, industrial products are entering North Korea. This is sort of in the short term not so bad because you don't eat machines, but 2 or 3 years from now, the economy will be suffering because they haven't made these investments.
So, Mr. Stanton, so the Trump administration has levied sanctions on 250 individuals and companies and vessels so far, which takes up about 50% of entire U.S. sanctions on North Korea. What do you think more needs to be done?
Well, I would specifically say that there are large money laundering enterprises focused in Southeast Asia and to a lesser extent Africa and, of course, China that we have left undesignated. Glocom, Pan Systems, Malaysia Korea Partners, Shinhung Trading, which directly supports the Ministry of State Security. I have said all along that it will be maximum pressure when we start to see 9-digit penalties on Chinese banks that are laundering money. The court filings tell us that the Chinese banking industry is turning a blind eye to money laundering. There are new enhanced due diligence requirements in effect. Willful blindness doesn't cut it anymore. And so if the administration really cracks down on this, we will begin to see not only that the effects are stronger, but that they're more carefully targeted against the people we're trying to hurt and not the people that we're not trying to hurt, who are North Korea's poor.
And Professor Brown, capping our discussion here, how badly do you think Chairman Kim needs a breakthrough to breathe new life into his economy in the new year?
You know, I think it's critically important for him, but he has a tough job. You know, reconciling the movement toward opening and reform versus the Stalinist state control that they always like to have. One, they can't have both. So I'm thinking they're moving toward the market. They're trying to liberalize, but there are big elements in North Korea, maybe Kim Jong-un, maybe not, who are resisting that change. And that's what we're seeing now right in Pyongyang today and this next month, this next year. Critical period in North Korea.
Well, we'll end our discussion here and now watch video for next.
That and fear that and keep pressure on North Korea is now being harmed by China's unwillingness to clamp down on that behavior.
China is North Korea's most important trading partner, taking up 92% of the North Korean trade last year. Beijing's secret aid and smuggling across the border is also considered to serve as an economic lifeline to Pyongyang. Now, Mr. Stanton, what do you think are the tools and avenues that Chinese authorities can lend support to Pyongyang without directly breaching the UN sanctions?
Well, the Chinese have historically done this by passively allowing Chinese companies such as Dandong Hongxiang and also its banking industry to support North Korea without direct state involvement. That allows it a certain plausible deniability that it's actually violating the sanctions. But what we see again and again is North Korean missiles are carried through the streets on Chinese logging trucks. We see trading companies in China that are doing massive amounts of trade with UN-designated entities and banks. We see finance is really not restricted against China, that North Korean, or by China against North Korea, that North Korean money launderers have the run of China. Banking representatives who are supposed to be expelled are not expelled, and front companies for UN-sanctioned entities pretty freely set up shell companies and register them in Hong Kong. So there is, and then finally there is, of course, the question of the ship-to-ship transfers off China's coast. There is much too much evidence of China looking the other way at these violations to conclude that it's less than deliberate.
And Professor Brown, Mr. Stanton just touched upon mainly the finance sector, but what do you think is the main avenue of help to North Korea?
Yeah. But China still provides, it's kind of odd, you know, they won't sell, illegally they won't sell that much, a little bit of gasoline to North Korea, but they give North Korea 500,000 tons of crude oil every year. Give it to it free. Maybe it's a long-term credit, they never have to pay it back. And that crude oil, 500,000 tons, is the bulk of North Korea's petroleum supply. We see all these ship-to-ship transfers, but the main thing is really the crude oil that goes in free, and it's okay with the UN for that to happen. So that's, I think, their main avenue of support.
And Mr. Stanton, why do you think it is the United Nations is not catching this crude oil supply to North Korea?
Well, because it's not being reported. So it's not a ban on crude oil. Remember, it's a 500,000 ton cap. And countries are supposed to report their supplies, whether paid or donated to North Korea, to the UN 1718 committee. They're clearly not doing that because a lot of it is being done by ship-to-ship transfer. Congress has been very much in a wait-and-see mode since Donald Trump's first summit with the North Koreans. We're about to see the end of that patience, particularly if, as I suppose, we're entering a period of greater tension with North Korea, that there will be more testing done of missiles or nuclear weapons. And then at that point, we're going to see more demands from Congress that the president enforce the sanctions that are mandatory, but that he has effectively paused.
And Mr. Brown, would you say China is the only lifeline to North Korea currently?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, the long term, clearly China is North Korea's biggest trading partner. Very, very important. But I think it's the geography of it. North Korea is a very strategic point in the world. And they've always been, and Kim Jong-un is playing the game of, well, if China, you don't support us, we'll get somebody else to support us. And others could be Japan. They're making some inroads with Japan, I think. South Korea, we see a lot. Russia, of course, even the United States.
So other than China, are there other holes to the sanctions enforcement around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Singapore is probably the largest. Malaysia is the second largest. And Vietnam is very important in the sense that it's probably hosting a lot of cyber attacks and cyber activity by North Korea. There are a number of countries in Africa that continue to both receive aid from the United States and buy arms from North Korea in violation of the sanctions. And then, of course, China is the biggest but not the only loophole. And so is Russia.
Well, we have so much to talk about, but we'll have to end our conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a photo of Chairman Kim visiting the newly built Tongcheon fish processing factory. Chairman Kim has been focusing on expanding the fish supply to respond to the country's food shortage. This particular factory had machines with ABB logos produced in Switzerland. Professor Brown?
Yes, this is pretty interesting, actually. I mean, fishing should be a good industry for North Korea. It requires much more than machinery. It requires oil, and the fishing boats need oil to go out, and they're apparently having a lot of trouble with that. So their little fishing boats are ending up in Japan, turning over, people dying because they're putting water in with the diesel. I mean, yeah, they can have a few machines. I don't know what that's going to do for the fish industry. Maybe a little bit. They like to show it off. But that's no solution for North Korea's problem.
Mr. Stanton?
When I see this picture, I see a tragedy because North Korea is one of the most protein deficient countries in the world in terms of the diet of its people. That's why the children are stunted. And yet, this is a government that produces seafood not for its own people. So here is a case where the UN, I think, has wisely tried to stop the North Korean government from selling the food that its people need to live. If we had reason to believe that these fish would be eaten by the people of North Korea, I would agree that the UN should support an exemption to allow that machinery to be brought into North Korea. I don't see that evidence.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Professor Brown, Mr. Stanton, thank you for joining us. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.